The intro.
Yeah, the intro of us just like talking and laughing with each other.
Yeah, he's doing this different every time.
Yeah.
Welcome to That's a Reach podcast, where we sit down to talk through questions about the Bible, theology, the gospel, and more, and how they influence your everyday life. You may have had these questions yourself, so we hope you find this conversation encouraging and clarifying in your pursuit of Jesus.
Hey everybody, welcome to That's a Reach podcast. This is Bob. We have another episode for you today. Okay, so we're going to start with this first question. Who is the morning star, and what is the significance of the name?
Okay, so I got into like a total rabbit hole with this actual thing this week because of having to look up different... I was looking up passages that have to do with Satan.
Yeah.
Right. And so,
which we can link in the show notes that you just preached on this.
Yes, right.
Sort of. It was in the sermon.
there. It was in there. Yeah, it wasn't the point.
Yeah.
But here's the thing that actually what got me is this. What I was looking for is the name Lucifer in the Bible, because I've always grown up hearing like, okay, Lucifer was the name for Satan before he fell from heaven, and I was like, okay, but if you Google where's Lucifer in the Bible, one of the verses you get is a verse in one of the epistles from Peter that is talking about Jesus. And it's like, first of all, most of your translations, if you open it up to any of the passages that say it should say Lucifer, it's not there. So if you're looking for Lucifer, you're going to get lost. But then secondly, you're going to find a verse that's talking about Jesus, and it's like, okay, now I'm confused. So I spent like 30 minutes this week just like trying to figure out where I was lost. So it turns out that Lucifer is the Latin word for the phrase morning star. So it's not actually a proper name for Satan. Now, the vernacular is still there. It's still, it's not like if you say Lucifer, somebody's going to be like, who's that? Like, yeah, we get it. Lucifer is not, like Jehovah. Jehovah's like not actually a name of God. It's like a mix of like, what is it, like Hebrew and German or something?
Yeah.
And so
it's a descriptive title.
Yes, right. Yeah. And so it's like, okay, I'm not going to stop saying Jehovah when like it'd be like I can't say God because it's too generic. I mean, it's fine. We know who we're talking about. Same with Lucifer. But what happens is if you look for Lucifer, what you're going to find is passages where it says morning star. Now, in the Old Testament, the passage I found, they are referring to Satan.
Yeah.
Like he's being referred to as the morning star, which was, to my best kind of estimation, like a term of endearment by God for him before he fell, before he sinned. And then Peter uses it as, in the same way that Satan should have been this thing, that this person that testified to God's creative brilliance with his beauty, but he fell instead. Peter uses the term morning star to refer to Jesus as the thing that really is pointing to God, right? It's almost like a poetic use of it. And I didn't look, but I think if you were to look up, if you were to look in the KJV, I wonder if we pulled that up. I don't think that they would. I think they would translate morning star as Lucifer in every place it talks about Satan, but where it talks about Jesus, it's just translated morning star. So that's how we differentiate who we're talking about in those passages.
Yeah.
But that's essentially, the morning star is supposed to be Satan.
Yeah. And like you said, it was it's not a name,
right?
Or even
a title.
It's not
a proper name. Yeah.
It's more like a term of endearment.
Yes. It was a descriptor of maybe his position, maybe just God's fondness for him, maybe his function, that he was the morning star, the thing that kind of rose and pointed people to God's amazing, brilliant creation.
Yeah, because Satan being a created spiritual being, God doesn't, as a created being, God doesn't hate him. God only hates sin.
Yeah, right.
And so it's one of those things that's just can be a bit of a mind trip, thinking about any sort of created reality before our own.
Yeah.
And
and because you have to understand, like, in the times where he's referenced as the morning star, he's referenced as the morning star pre-falling.
Yes.
You know, he's he was an angel.
Yeah.
He was, again, that's why I point to that Ezekiel 28 passage in that sermon, because before he fell, he was in God's presence. He was one of the probably the highest ranking, as far as we know, one of the highest ranking angels. I mean, we have very limited knowledge about what the angel hierarchy looks like, but
yes. And we've talked about angels before in this as well, where it's like is it necessary to know to understand like God and the gospel? Like no. Like it's not even a secondary issue. It's very, very tertiary,
and that's actually why
important.
That's why God doesn't give us more information on it, because it would be a distraction.
Yes, yeah. Any of those types of things can be a distraction, and humans, especially as we see in the example of the Old Testament, they very quickly will fall into some sort of idolatry. Anything that we think we understand, then we feel like we have our grip around it, and now it's the thing that we're focused on.
Yeah, right. Well, and it's easy to obsess over because it's fascinating. Like, what is this war that happened in the heavens, and Satan was cast out of heaven, and it's like, it's kind of mythological, and in that way, but like in the same vein, it's like mythological in a sense of like true. It's like you look at like Norse fiction and you're like, it's just fiction, or Norse mythology, and it's like, it's just fiction. But then all of a sudden you look at like this story that God seems to be telling us about what happened to produce Satan, and it's like, oh, that's cool. Like, why has nobody made that movie? Like, I mean, John Milton tried before movies, wrote Paradise Lost, but
that's true. Cool. Anything else, Bob?
No, I think that's good. Definitely. I think your sermon from Sunday will just provide more info on that, so we'll link that in the show notes. But okay, question number 2. Please explain Psalm 139:8. My NASB says, "If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, behold, you are there." I'm confused about the word Sheol. My NASB says it means the netherworld. The KJV says hell. The NLT says the grave. And the NIV says the depths. I've always taken Sheol to mean hell, but I've always had the understanding God is not or cannot be in hell. Am I overthinking this, or is it just of some sort of idiom or something like that?
Okay, so I want to start by saying that, yes, you are overthinking this question, and here's why. The psalmist is clearly using this as poetic and metaphorical language. What they're dwelling on is God's omnipresence, that he is everywhere, that he's not somebody you can escape. Jonah tries to flee from the Lord's presence and finds out like that's impossible, right? And so on the one hand, you don't want to use the psalm for the wrong purpose. And the psalmist is not saying, like, I tried to go to hell and get away from you, but I couldn't. Then I tried to go to heaven and get away from you, but you were right there. Like, it's not meant to be taken that way. Yes, it is. It's a psalm about God's God being everywhere, you being in his presence at all times. But I think that is really the heart of what's happening in that passage. But let's talk about Sheol for a second. I think that some of this question is because a lot of times what I will say when I'm talking about hell to young adults is I say hell is wrath. Wrath is separation.
Yeah.
So hell is that you are not with God, right? Hell is not so much a location, and it may be. I want to be clear. I don't know that hell's not a location. It may be a location where you are the most separate from God you can be, but essentially it's more of a status than it is a place, right? It's separation from God. And so I don't want to go too far off on a tangent, but when we think about like Jesus, I was actually just reading, I don't know which creed it is that says Jesus descended into hell.
Apostles' Creed.
Is it the Apostles' Creed? And so there's here's the thing. There's a lot of question about the verses that seem to imply that Jesus went to a place and preached the gospel or whatever, was in hell. The question I've been asked several times is like, where did Jesus go when he died for 3 days? And there's a lot of like, we're not 100% sure. There's some verses that seem to say very clearly one way. There's some verses that, if you really dissect them, they have some room for meaning. But when did Jesus definitely experience hell? On the cross.
Yeah.
In
separated.
that moment that God was turning his back on him, right? And separate from him. So so going back to the question, this idea of like, okay, is God in hell? It's not that God is not in hell. It's that all you experience of God in hell is his justice, his wrath, his separation. Another way to think about this is, metaphorically speaking, the phrase I've used is, the only part of God that's in hell is his back. It's like you're forced for all of eternity to know that God has rejected you, essentially.
Yeah.
And so the point is not whether or not God is physically present in hell or even spiritually present in hell. It's that you cannot experience him in any good way at all. You are absent of God in joy, mercy, grace, peace, hope, like all gone. The only part of him that you will experience is essentially his absence, which isn't speaking about whether or not he's actually present, but what your experience of him is, you know?
Yeah.
And so you don't want to get hung up on, like, is there this lake of fire somewhere where God is not, and how did the psalmist go there to try to get away from God?
Yeah.
It's like, that's all. None of that is what's happening, right? The point is, you can't even go to hell to get away from God, because even in hell, what you're experiencing is God's justice. You're still in. Another way to think of it is this: in heaven, your relationship will be perfected to God in grace and mercy. In hell, your relationship will be perfected to God in justice.
Yeah.
But your relationship will still be to the perfect God.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, that's true. I think going back to what Christ experienced on the cross, our purpose in how God created us is for relationship. And so what is the ultimate torture then would be to experience the stark contrast opposite of what you were created for.
Yeah, and to even add on to that, not just relationship, which is yes,
Yeah.
but relationship with him specifically.
That's what I'm saying.
Right.
Like, so, Christ, who is a part of the Trinity, who exists in eternal perfect relationship with God, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, for the Father to turn his back on him, that is experiencing the aspect of hell.
Yes.
That is our punishment.
Yes.
He bore the weight of our sin, and the perfect God of the universe turned his back on him.
Yes.
That is the punishment. And so the eternity of hell is existing in eternity with God's back on you.
Yes.
You were created to be in communion with the
Yeah,
God
to
of
see
the
God
universe.
face to face.
And so when you have the entire opposite for forever, like that's the
Horrible.
problem.
Yeah, right.
And that, going back to, we were talking about this in our residents are going through Old Testament survey right now, and we're looking at Genesis. And the book of Genesis is the foundation for understanding biblical theology for the rest of the Bible. So going to Genesis 1, 2, and 3, the first people, our earthly parents, were created to walk in perfect harmony with God. And when did death, sin, and hell come into the world? Well, it was when they broke that perfect relationship. And so now it is a broken, marred version of that God said, I'm going to fix this. But the eternal punishment, if you do not go along with the Messiah, is that the brokenness will be complete.
Yeah, right.
And the relationship will be severed.
Right. You reminded me, talking about the Old Testament, that one of the aspects of this question we also need to answer is just the term Sheol.
Yeah.
Part of it is you have to understand who's using that phrase, right? These are ancient Israelites. It's an Old Testament concept of the afterlife. Now, I'm not saying that their version was wrong, I'm not saying it was literal, I'm not saying it was metaphorical. I'm saying this is how they understood it. I don't really know if they understood this to be literal, or if they understood this to be metaphorical, or if maybe they understood it to be literal and it's not, right? Like, I don't know if they were even right about how they understood it. But their version of Sheol was essentially like a waiting area in the afterlife, waiting for Judgment Day. And even then, you look at things like Jesus' parable and things like this, there seems to be a concept of it, the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. There seems to be a concept of it where you can wait in one side that's waiting, like Abraham's bosom, it's like waiting to be with God, and you can be waiting in the other side of Sheol, which is basically just the waiting room for hell, and it's pretty bad already.
Mhm.
You know, so right, wrong, or indifferent, that's the concept that you're working with in Sheol. And so, again, that kind of context is important when you hear, like, when you think about the way the psalmist is talking about Sheol. Like, he has maybe a different concept than just it's hell.
Yeah.
You know, it may not be what he's trying to say.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Is it, we're gonna talk about this in real time because I don't have my phone. It's recording this right now. But Sheol, is it the place outside the camp in their terms, or is that a different word? Because so many words for separation get used for hell and separation and stuff.
Like Gehenna is
that's what I'm thinking of.
Yeah.
Yes, that is the
Yeah.
place outside the camp where it's the death and
bodies
the rotting.
and the
It's the
worms and,
dumping ground.
Yes.
And so similarly, when talking about hell, that will get referenced, like being in Gehenna. And it's like, yeah, because that's where no one wants to go.
Right.
It's the bad thing. And it's not because, ooh, it's gross and torturous. It's because thinking of going back to the question says, is this just an idiom? Yes. The answer is yes. It is just an idiom. Right. But their understanding of that, when you're thinking of, especially a ancient Israelite, where you would want to go, or where you wouldn't want to go. Why would you not want to go to a bad place? Because it would make you ceremonially unclean,
right.
and then you wouldn't be allowed to be in the presence of God or in the presence of the assembly.
Well, and you're dead on. It even goes into the setup of the camp when they're in the wilderness, right? The tabernacle's at the center. The Levites have the most privilege because they are right next to the tabernacle.
Yeah, they're working in the center.
So the closer you are, and here's the other thing. If you go look at a bunch of, like, for instance, in Numbers, where do the plagues and fires and bad things always happen? They start on the outskirts of the camp. So the closer you were to the center, the more safe you were, you know? This is why when you have the rebellions in, like, when the Midianite women are coming into the camp and they're taking them all the way to the center of the camp to do sexually immoral things near the tabernacle, that's why you get, Phineas stabbing people with a spear, because it was so offensive to be that close to God in the center committing these unrighteous acts, But that's exactly it. If you were unclean, you were outside the camp, so now you were vulnerable.
Yeah.
You were going to be hit by all the bad things of the world.
And that's why going through ceremonial law, like the Levitical law and stuff like that, and we've talked about law on this before, that there's moral law, there's judicial law, and then there's the ceremonial law, and it's talking about how to be clean. Why was that so important? It wasn't just because they were dealing with COVID and they needed hand sanitizer. It's not that type of cleanliness, but it was clean to be worthy of being in the presence of God and the assembly of others that were following Yahweh, because we were created for a relationship with God and with each other. And so when you were unclean, then you were not fulfilling your purpose of creation, of being close to God and close to the other people that were following God. And so, anyways, just going back to this idea of hell and Sheol and Gehenna and all those that get thrown around, again, like what Taylor was saying, it's not that we need to understand, is this a place? Is it a state of being? Like, what's going on there? Ultimately, it's just, it is the complete opposite of what is satisfying and what we were created for. And that in and of itself is a big deal. And we don't want to talk about and understand hell because it's scary and we want people to get their ticket out of hell. That's why they need Jesus. The deal is, sin separates you from what you're created for, and it's not satisfying. And so dealing with sin so that you can, realizing that you can't fix your sin and you need Christ to fix your sin, not so I can escape hell, but so I can escape the thing that separates me from what I was created for, from what's going to ultimately satisfy me on an eternal basis. And that's why we need to understand all of these things. But Psalm 139 in general, it's not talking about hell in a literal place in that regard. The whole purpose of the psalm is just talking about God's sovereignty and being able to be in his presence, even when we feel like we're so far away. Ultimately, we're not that far away. So anything else on that, Bob?
No, that's good. That's good. Okay. Last question for the episode. How is humankind inherently sinful? I understand that we lie, that we steal, and that we cheat, but how did we all become sinful through Adam? How is sin automatically ingrained into a newborn child that has had no time or awareness to actively sin?
So talking about inheriting sin, think about what we believe of who Christ is, born of a virgin. Why does that matter? Do men pass on sin? Are we extra sinful in that regard? We got to, again, thinking of the context of what is being shown here. Even in the context, we understand as Gentiles, when I come to faith, I am adopted into the family of God. I am an heir to the eternal kingdom, essentially the spiritual little brother to Christ, the one and only Son. So it has inheritance type of connotation to that. The Father is passing on the rights of his kingdom, and the kingdom that Adam passed on was he was guilty of bringing sin into the world, and so Christ's father was God. He was born of a virgin, and so he did not inherit sin. So that way he could on the cross pay for our sin, being the perfect spotless lamb. And now I forgot what the question was.
So, yeah, we're talking about original sin.
Original
right?
sin, yes.
Yeah.
And so that's thinking about our theological understanding of what the Bible shows who Jesus Christ was will help us understand. In my view, in my experience of it, it helped me understand of what inherited sin is, especially now being a father and like having little kids and thinking about that. And there's the normal preacher joke, the normal church joke of like, well, did you teach your kid to lie? And they started figuring that out when they're pretty young. It's like, yeah, sure. Because we're all broken, and that's a pretty good example. But really, like theologically, I was just still wrestling like, but what does that mean? As I started to unpack and understand more of who Christ was and what he was accomplishing and how he was accomplishing it, it made me understand the concept of original sin better, how it was inherited in that regard.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things an easy analogy for this is if your parents are a slave and they have you as a child, what are you?
Slave,
you're a slave. Like if you're born into a slave family, you're a slave. That's what happens. So our parents are born into the slavery of sin, and we are born after them into the slavery of sin. Now, there's always like the argument of like, okay, well that's not fair because if I wasn't born into this is where you get into the whole Christ is the second Adam. Okay, because the idea is this. Okay, fine, you get your clean shot. You're not born into slavery to sin. You get to make the choice. Adam and Eve were the best of us. Mm-hmm. They were the best of us. They had every advantage possible to not fall into sin, and they did. You weren't going to do better.
Yeah.
Right? And so, okay, fine. It's not fair that you didn't get your shot. But the best of us failed. So everybody since then has been sold into that slavery, except for Jesus, because he wasn't born to his earthly father who was a slave to sin. He was born to his heavenly father who was not a slave to sin.
Yeah.
Right? And then the last aspect of this gets into the tricky place of the age of accountability. And that's part of this question, right? Is like, okay, but a baby, Well, I've been hashing this one out for a while because there is some verses that seem to point to an age of accountability. We get very little information on that. And I've always said the reason that we don't have a very clearly defined doctrine of the age of accountability in the Bible is because humans would abuse that knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
It'd be like, why not kill babies? They go straight to heaven. Mm-hmm. And it's like, okay, I'm glad God didn't give us that information because we would not use it correctly. Okay, but when you think about this, back to this analogy of being born to your parents started a rebellion against God. They are in a war against a king.
Yeah.
Okay? And then you're born a baby. Well, guess what? You're part of the rebellion because you belong to your parents and your parents are fighting a war against the king. Well, when the king finally wins and he sentences your parents to execution because they rebelled, he can pardon the baby because the baby was just a baby.
Yeah.
Right? And so the idea is you're just as guilty. You're born into that rebellion, and yet the king is offering you grace and mercy because you are an infant.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the idea behind the age of accountability. Help me understand it. What is going on over there?
AJ's dancing in the hallway.
Dumb.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So that's the idea of, original sin and how we both inherit it, how we wouldn't have done better if we were free from it in the first place, and also how we believe that God is just when an infant dies.
Yeah. I think with that, and when you mentioned, it doesn't seem fair and all those things, and people can really get hung up on that in my experience. But when you just sit and marinate on the fact that it's also not fair that God would willingly save you out of that.
Yeah, right.
Like, that's not fair either.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of unfairness going on here. So
well, and most of it, what we always fail to realize is that we're spitting in God's face with sin.
Yes.
So the fact that He has loved us as sinners to send His Son, die on the cross to save us.
Yes.
It's like, don't talk about fairness to God.
Yeah.
It's not going to work out for you.
Yeah. Because just the story of Christ and what He did, going back to the discussion about hell, being separated, being broken, and
in a way He never deserved.
Yeah, and feeling that separation from His eternal existence with the Heavenly Father, that's not fair.
Yeah.
And He did it while literally being spat on and praying for the forgiveness of those that were doing it.
Right.
So yeah, it's not fair.
Yeah. This is where Peter says, for Christ also suffered for sins once for all time, the just for the unjust, so that He might bring us to God. It's like, you don't have a leg to stand on here.
Yeah.
I'm sorry that you were born into slavery to sin. You would have fallen into sin anyway had you been Adam or Eve. So now it's back to the original question, which is not about whether or not you're guilty of sin. It's, are you going to repent and be saved?
Yeah. There is a easy way out.
Yeah, right.
In that regard.
Right.
And it's not fair. And so take the thing that's not fair, be excited, and then help share that with other people.
Right.
So they realize, like, hey, there's a way out of this.
Right.
There is salvation that's available. What do you have to add, Bob?
I think that's all good.
Awesome.
So
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks for listening to this episode of That's Reach Podcast. Continue to send in your questions. We need more. So stay tuned for the next one. That's a wrap.
Goodbye.
Thanks for joining us on That's a Reach. We are pastors and leaders from the Reach Young Adult Ministry at Evergreen Church in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and these questions come from those in our young adult community here. If you're from a different church and context, we hope you found the discussion beneficial and edifying as you pursue spreading the gospel of Jesus Christ in your culture and context.